Hello everyone. Today in this video session we are going to focus on Unit 5, the Hellenic Civilization, and we will make a brief revision of the unit within the scope of the course Introduction to World Civilization. Before going into detail of the unit, let's revise our objective for that unit. And at the end of the unit, if you read and go through all the content, you will be able to analyze the origin of the Hellenic civilization and its main components. You will be able to explain the religion of the Hellenic civilization. You will be able to characterize the civilizing society and culture of the Hellenic civilization. And at the end of the unit, you will be able to get familiar with the civilizing infrastructure of the Hellenic civilization. Before we start revising our unit, I would like to highlight an important point, which is the difference between Hellenic and Hellenistic words. And you should be very careful and not confused about these terms, because the Hellenic period is also defined as the age of classical Greece and should not be confused with the Hellenistic civilization, which labels the period between the death of Alexander and Rome's conquest of Greece before Christ 323 to 31. And when we touch upon the origin of the Hellenic civilization and its main components, we have several subtopics such as the political governance, the character of the land, the philosophy, theater, history, and the colonization of the unit. When we focus on the origin, the first topic we would like to focus on is the political governance. In the Hellenic civilization, we can see a kind of limited democracy. This limited democracy is in the shape of the political governance of some recognized citizens in the face of a powerful monarchy with the support of national religion. And in addition to this, there were some variations in the governing models of the cities. For example, in Athens, the people and the governing model was more open to outer sources, and the mobility of the people were allowed. Whereas in Sparta, the governing model was much more conservative in terms of political and social aspects. The second is about the character of the land. In fact, the land on which the Hellenic civilization was settled had a mountainous topography, and this, of course, had some influences on the social structure of the civilization. And in this sense, food production was the most critical need of people, and it was also the primary occupation of the people in this civilization. And the third thing about the main components of the Hellenic civilization, we can see very important names in the field of philosophy, such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, whose ideas are still influential on most of the Western societies, and they focus these scholars in detail in the aspect of cultural elements. And finally, the issue of colonization was an important aspect of the origins of the Hellenic civilization, because some of the cities, especially Corinth, actively promoted colonization in those years to lessen and decrease the effects of the expanding population. Colonization was used as a kind of strategy to lessen the negative effects of expanding population in the Hellenic civilization. And another important issue in those years was, of course, the religion. And if we examine the religion in Hellenic civilization, we can see that it has some distinct features. The first one is the issue of polytheistic. First of all, we can say that the religion was polytheistic. That means people had many gods and goddesses reflecting the life as it was lived in the civilization. These gods had certain qualities, such as being immortal, and they also shared certain similar characteristics with the human beings. They also had some domains, for example, Zeus as the lord of the sky and Poseidon as the lord of the sea. And this theistic feature was the most notable thing among the religious beliefs in Hellenic civilization. And secondly, we can see the impact of Greek mythology underlying many religious beliefs in those years. In other words, the Greek mythology provided a kind of explanation in those years in the eyes of people, especially for the natural phenomenon. For example, destructive storms were believed to be created by Zeus, or some destructive storms in the sea reflected the anger of Poseidon, or the victory in battles was the evidence of Athena's pleasure. And people used to provide some explanations for the natural phenomena based on their beliefs of these gods. And thirdly, towards the end of the classical period, we can see the impact of Romans. Romans adopted and adapted Greek mythology and religious thoughts, so we can see that Roman gods and goddesses were religiously practiced with new names towards the end of the classical period. And finally, of course, there were some criticism regarding these beliefs and the existence of these gods in those years. Especially the intellectuals criticized certain aspects of these gods and goddesses. For example, their being immortal were severely criticized, but whatever the criticism is, we can easily see that this format of religion was a fundamental part of the life in Hellenic civilization. Well, it would be a good idea to say a few words regarding the civilizing society of the Hellenistic civilization. First of all, I would like to mention about the people and how they lived and survived in the society. In the Hellenistic society, in fact, men lived better lives than the women did. Only men could be full citizens. They had all the rights of normal citizens. On the other side, women were restricted even from leaving their home, except some household things and looking after children. And that was also the case even after their marriage. And we can say that there were big differences between men and women in Hellenistic societies. And as for the education, there was also a difference between boys and girls. Boys were educated to become good citizens. However, girls were taught housekeeping and how to care for the family. The education of children also differed from cities to cities. For example, in Sparta, boys were trained to become good warriors and a kind of military force. However, in Athens, students were educated to take part in voting. Again, we can see certain differences in terms of education between males and females. And in terms of the economy in those years, the economy was largely defined by the region's dependence on imported goods, and agriculture was of particular importance since almost 80% of the population was busy with farming and agriculture, and it was the main source of income for these people. There were also some mine deposits, especially in Greece part, in Athens, and this contributed to the development of Athens in the 5th century BCE. And finally, trading had an important role in the economy, and the growth of it led to the development of some financial techniques in the Hellenic civilization. The last thing was the military. It had an important place in the society of Hellenic civilization. The city-states, in fact, in those years had no standard armies. Instead, they relied mostly on the citizens to provide manpower for the military force. And this is called as the militia force, composing citizens as the soldiers. When a battle broke up, all these citizens left their families and they attended the war as the military power. And the other topic is how the culture was civilized in the Hellenic civilization. And as I said before, ancient Greek has had an important impact on Western civilization, even in today's world, starting with the literature, especially the example of the epic poem Iliad and Odyssey, which was one of the first works in the Western literature. The Hellenic civilization was also the home to many other firsts in humanities, such as the first recorded history and historians, and the initial development of the dramatic plays, and the first practitioner of maths, and the fundamental work in classical Western philosophy. And all these firsts in humanities are still influential in Western civilizations. And in terms of the cultural elements, mythology also had an important role. As you know, it's the set of stories about the life of gods and goddesses, heroes and rituals in ancient Greek, and it still gets the attraction of many people in the world. The people are interested in the events experienced by these gods and goddesses and their relationship. And philosophy was also an important cultural element in Hellenic civilization. You should keep in your mind several names such as Socrates, who examined the ethical matters in ancient Greek, or Plato, who covered the topics such as politics, epistemology, and metaphysics, and Aristotle, who focused on many topics like human life and world's nature, and these philosophers are still influential on modern philosophy. And finally, there were some important improvements in science and technology in Hellenic civilization. For instance, in mathematics, the Tales of Miletus originated some theorems incorporated in the geometry of Euclid, and in medicine, the work of Hippocrates in the 5th and 4th centuries BC laid the foundations for the clinical medicine and the practice of surgery. As the final subtopic, we can give a brief information about the infrastructure in the Hellenic civilization. In those years, city-states developed some temples and public buildings with agoras as the center of the commerce and political meetings. And in those years, most of the houses were built from stone and clay, and the policies, the cities, were centered on a small town and the countryside that surrounded it. And a typical polis consisted of people living in compact group houses within a city. And the mode of transportation were extremely costly in those years, and the wagons, carriages, carts were the major vehicles to carry people and goods. And to sum up, in this video session, we mainly focused on the main components of the Hellenic civilization and how the society and the culture of Hellenic civilization were civilized. And we focused on the religion, its components, and the criticism about them. And we provided a brief information about the infrastructure of the Hellenic civilization. Of course, this session was a kind of brief summary of the unit. In order to get the full meaning and content of this unit, it's a better idea to focus on the chapter and go through it in detail. I hope we are going to focus on these elements in another session.